Hi, I'm Pastor Scott Weatherford. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about how to become like Jesus more and more every day. What does that really mean? And really, what does God expect for us? And how does He grow our lives to be more like Christ? In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 15 through 18, there's an unusual passage. Paul is talking about the process of discipleship. Discipleship means becoming more like Christ. That's really what it means. We have a lot of misconceptions about this, but let's talk about that. And Paul references back to an Old Testament account. Now, let me just set up with some history that you might find this interesting or not. Hopefully you will. Paul was a biblical scholar. He had the entire Old Testament memorized. So when he taught in his teachings and his writings, he was referring back to this wonderful reservoir of information he had. And in this particular passage, he gives an account about Moses. And he talks about how God was working in Moses' life. Now, what's really cool about discipleship, God's process of making us more like Himself has been historic all throughout God's Word. From Noah believing God, Abraham believing God, all the way to Moses and his encounter with God. And you'll see that God is shaping us to be like Christ. Romans 8:29 says this, that He predestined, He foreknew us so that we might become conformed to the image of Christ, which is pretty amazing. But in this passage, Paul is taking on this adventure. He said, in Moses with a veiled face. Now, if you have no idea what that means, it's kind of like, okay, what's this? Moses like having some kind of fashion crisis? He's veiling his face, had some cosmetic surgery he had to cover up. What was up with Moses? Well, I'll just take you back to Exodus and I'll talk to you about it. Moses goes up on the mountain, he meets with God. Pretty cool assignment, nice appointment, don't want to be late. He goes up on the mountain and he has such a divine encounter with God for 40 days. He comes down off the mountain, his face, his countenance is literally glowing. It's glowing so bright that the people of Israel can't look on him. And so he puts a veil over his face to help them be able to contain the glory of God. Now, Paul is using this analogous. He's saying, now, hey, the closer you get to God, the closer you get to Jesus, the more you take on His radiance, His countenance. And I think that's an amazing thought, how God shapes and does that to us. But how does He do that? How does God make us become more like Him? Well, I want to offer a few things that you might want to consider. The first thing He really does, He uses His Word. If we're not in His Word, we're not reading and praying and focusing on Him and having our minds fixed on Christ, we're not going to become more and more like Him. In fact, I hear this a lot. People go to church and they say, I'm just not being fed. Well, if you're not feeding yourself, you're going to be hungry. You know what I'm saying? So in this matter of saying, I'm going to be self-disciplined enough to spend time in God's Word, to spend time in prayer, maybe it's journaling, maybe it's solitude, maybe it's other disciplines. So God uses those things to help us to become more like Christ. And it's not just the random reading where you can check off the box, but it's the intentionality of spending time with God. But then there's something else God uses. And I think God uses this in a huge way. God uses trouble to make us more like Jesus. Now, James says this in James chapter 1, chapter 1, verse 2, he said, consider it all joy when you face trials or troubles of many kinds. And Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. Fear not, I've overcome the world. So trials are a part of our life. That's a part of our human experience. And probably some of you are going through them right now. I heard a pastor say this, that you're either about to go through a trial, or you're going through a trial, or one's just around, or you're getting over a trial. But trials and troubles are a part of our existence. Now, how does God use those things to shape us to be more like Christ? Well, what I've discovered is that in times of trial and times of trouble, there becomes a desire for rescue, a desire to know God and to follow Him and to be more like Christ in these situations. And that's why James says, consider it joy. Not that we have some kind of silly thought, like, woohoo, here we go. But this idea is that God is going to leverage this for me to be more mature, me more dependent, me more able to link into Christ. And so I know as a leader, when I see trials and troubles coming, especially within the church family that I'm leading, I have a tendency to get excited because I know God's about to show us something, take us to a new level, encourage us. And so we know this in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. He says he causes all things to work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So God uses trials and troubles. But I want to give you another thing that you might not even suspect that God uses. God uses temptation to make us more like Christ. What? Well, James says this, that, temptation doesn't come from God. No, that's Satan's deal. And Satan, he uses a couple of things to really aggravate us. He uses accusation. He accuses us about our past and what we once were. And I just remember only two entities in all the world that accuse you of your past. That's Satan and your extended family. They always remind you what you once were. But this accusation part, and then there's the temptation part. Now, I've heard this, and you have too. God's not going to lay on you any more than you can bear. That's a lie. That's a lie. We always get more stuff than we can bear. But God's not going to lay anything on you that he cannot bear. And there's going to be no temptation given to you that God's not going to give you a way out. There's a door of escape. That when you trust in the Lord, when you're walking in him, when your face is shining with the glory of his presence, you're more aware to find the way out that God has for you. So if you want to get over temptation in your life, get close to Jesus. If you want to go through and endure the trials of your life, get close to Jesus. If you really want to know Christ, spend time with Jesus. It's not about you, it's about him. But he is all about making you more like him. I think that's pretty exciting. God uses these things. Now, one other thing I want to leave you with. The closer you walk with the Lord, the more willing you are to obey him, and the clearer his voice, his direction in your life becomes. Whether it's the revelation through his word, the wooing in your heart, the encouragement for other believers, God uses these things to make you more like Jesus. And that's what he wants for you. So don't be intimidated. Lean in. Have a veiled face because you've been with Jesus, then everybody else around you will benefit. Remember, we live one life, all for Jesus.